Shadow budgets, how mass incarceration steals from the poor to give to the prison. Revenues from communication fees, commissary purchases, disciplinary fines, and more flow into inmate welfare funds meant to benefit incarcerated populations. However, our analysis of prison systems across the US reveals that they are used more like slush funds that, in many cases, make society's most vulnerable people pay for prison operations, staff salaries, benefits, and more. Prisons and jails generate billions of dollars each year by charging incarcerated people and their communities steep prices for phone calls, video calls, e-messaging, money transfers, and commissary purchases. A lot of that money goes back to corrections agencies in the form of kickbacks. But what happens to it from there? As it turns out, much of this money flows into special accounts called inmate welfare funds. These welfare funds are supposed to be used for non-essential purchases that collectively benefit the incarcerated population. In reality, poorly written policies and lax oversight make welfare funds an irresistible target for corruption in jails and prisons. In many cases, corrections officials have wide discretion to use welfare funds as shadow budgets for subsidizing essential facility operations, staff salaries, vehicles, weapons, and more, instead of paying for such things out of their department's more transparent and accountable general budget. How do welfare funds get funded? How is the money used, and who gets to decide? We analyze laws and policies governing welfare funds in all 50 state prison systems and the Federal Bureau of Prisons to find out. We identified at least 49 prison systems that have some form of welfare fund, though it's likely that every system has one. In most cases, they are funded through communications fees and store purchases, as we mentioned, as well as interest accrued on individual trust accounts. Some prison systems also fund them with sums of money confiscated from people who escape custody, contraband, or disciplinary fines. Although welfare funds are generally meant to be used for recreation equipment, entertainment, social and educational opportunities, and other non-essential benefits for the incarcerated population as a whole, prison policies frequently allow them to pay for facility construction and maintenance, hygiene products for indigent people, release-related costs, and other goods and services that are supposed to come out of a department's general budget. Our analysis reveals that most policies are so vague that prison officials enjoy wide discretion to spend incarcerated people's money as they please, sometimes spending it on luxury perks for staff.
Only 12 prison systems, 24%, explicitly prohibit certain kinds of spending, while roughly one-third do not specify any transparency or oversight measures for these accounts. Some prison systems earmark a portion of the money to be transferred to other funds. In Florida, revenues in excess of $32 million must be sent to the state's general revenue fund, while Arizona requires $500,000 be transferred from their welfare fund to the Corrections Building Renewal Fund. In states like Iowa, North Carolina, and West Virginia, funds can be used on expenses relating to victims' compensation or reimbursing victims' travel expenses. Meanwhile, journalists have uncovered multiple instances in which millions of dollars were extracted from incarcerated populations and not spent at all despite the extraordinary needs of people on the inside. Prisons will sometimes sit on heaps of money while jails treat themselves to shopping sprees for bullets, break room supplies, and gift cards for honey-baked hams. These corrupt practices shift essential costs, historically the responsibility of governments, to incarcerated people and their support networks and, in the process, often force women, low-income families, and communities of color to subsidize mass incarceration.
The rationale behind these welfare funds is complicated, controversial, and contested among advocates and incarcerated people. Some believe it's useful for incarcerated people to have a pool of money that can be used for their collective benefit and argue that, if these funds are going to exist, incarcerated people should have greater decision-making power over how their money is spent, and officials should be more accountable in terms of their use. Others argue welfare funds should be abolished on the principle that fees and fines should not be extracted from incarcerated people and their communities, and state and local governments should bear the full financial burden of incarceration. Notably, in some places, incarcerated people seem unaware these funds even exist because their balances and expenditures are not shared with the population.
The widespread lack of oversight and accountability plays a role in all three of these positions. Roughly one-third, 17 out of 49, of prison policies do not mention any form of oversight or transparency measures for their welfare funds. Among the 32 other prison systems with welfare funds, policies mandate a range of annual or biannual audits and reports that summarize revenues and expenditures. These audits and reports are variously required to be submitted internally to wardens, department fiscal offices, or deputy directors, for example, or externally to controllers, comptrollers, governors, legislators, or other bodies. In some cases, there is no clearly defined schedule for reporting. Indiana, for example, specifies that periodic audits be conducted by the State Board of Accounts. In Georgia, reporting is necessary only upon suspicion of fraud, changes in personnel managing the fund, or extensive funding shortages. Meanwhile, just 5 states, California, Kentucky, Maryland, Nevada, and Washington state, require that prisons post audits publicly within view of the incarcerated population.
Who exactly administers these funds and how they go about doing that is also unclear in many of the policies we reviewed. Typically, welfare funds are run by higher-ranking corrections officials, such as a warden, deputy warden, and chief administrative officer, superintendent, director, commissioner, or one of their designees. 14 prison systems have some form of board or committee that governs the welfare fund, but only 3, California, Minnesota, and Vermont, explicitly permit incarcerated representatives to participate. Mississippi, meanwhile, permits a relative of an incarcerated person to serve as a representative. Generally, the fund administrator is in charge of approving or denying expenditures and keeping track of the funds entering and leaving the account. Few policies explain how often these committees are supposed to meet, nor do they go into very much detail about their specific responsibilities and whether a committee exists in policy is a separate matter from whether it operates in practice.
Given this context, incarcerated people and their support networks should not be forced to subsidize government responsibilities through welfare funds. Given the general state of unaccountability in U.S. corrections, it will be a tall order to secure meaningful oversight and decision-making power over these funds. These piles of money seem irresistible to corrections agencies, and the potential for abuse and corruption is high. But in recognition of the lack of consensus about their place in corrections, including among incarcerated people, as well as the wide variation in welfare fund policy, practice, and political context, we offer several policy recommendations to help advocates and lawmakers mitigate their harms. Explained in greater detail in the recommendations section below, these include ending exploitative pricing schemes in communications and commissaries, revising policies on permitted uses and prohibitions to be more explicit, implementing independent oversight and granting incarcerated people greater decision-making power, and reducing the need to supplement corrections budgets through decarceration.
How welfare funds subsidize mass incarceration.
It's important that we get a sense of where welfare funds came from and how they fit into the broader economy of jails and prisons. There are, unfortunately, few histories available, but tracking the evolution of these funds in California provides a glimpse at the forces that have made them what they are today. California's welfare fund was established in 1949. The idea was to permit sheriffs to sell tobacco, candy, and other items to the incarcerated population so long as the profits went into a fund intended for their general welfare. Originally, California's welfare fund policy stipulated that they were solely to be used for the benefit, education, and welfare of incarcerated people and that normal expenses, like medical services and clothing, had to be paid for out of the sheriff's general budget. That changed in 1993 when policy reforms permitted their use to augment those required county expenses as determined by the sheriff to be in the best interests of inmates. Those best interests were not specified, granting sheriffs wide latitude to spend the money as they wished. This shift coincided with a wave of privatization that gave us for-profit prisons and the outsourcing of communications and commissary services to corporate vendors. As privatization spread, welfare fund balances ballooned and, in the process, became irresistible cash cows for corrections agencies.
Attorney and researcher Stephen Rayer, who has fought the financial exploitation of incarcerated people and their communities for many years, coined the term prison retailing to distill how vendors like phone companies and commissary contractors transform state responsibilities into sources of revenue for themselves and their correctional agency partners. For example, when a prison system takes one of its responsibilities, like providing incarcerated people with phone services, and sells it off to a telecommunications company, it creates a new market. That market operates by charging fees to service users, incarcerated people and their communities, which enriches both the telecom company in the form of profit and the prison system in the form of kickbacks. Prison systems deposit their kickbacks into opaque, unaccountable, and ill-defined funds allegedly intended for the general welfare of the imprisoned population, but which prison administrators can use on practically whatever they want. This carceral sleight of hand displaces the financial responsibilities of jails and prisons onto impacted communities and rebrands it as the selfless goodwill of corrections agencies. And though it may not seem like corrections staff directly pocket revenues from prison retailing, the reality is that subsidizing jail and prison operations contributes to their job security, if not directly funding their actual salaries and benefits.
Herein lies a vicious cycle of exploitation in the form of an arms race for higher commissions. Contractors make their money through commissions, and they ensure their future profits by rewarding corrections agencies with kickbacks that will entice them to renew their contracts. But bigger kickbacks require vendors to continuously raise prices to keep their profits growing. At the same time, corrections agencies come to rely on kickbacks to supplement costs that should be paid for out of their legislatively appropriated budgets.
Though welfare funds represent a comparatively small proportion of corrections budgets, the millions of dollars sapped from incarcerated people are nonetheless significant sums of money that jails and prisons do not need to secure from lawmakers. Without a transparent public budgeting process, corrections agencies can grow this shadow budget free from scrutiny and oversight. In the end, mass incarceration is to some degree supported by an inversion of welfare for the poor, as scholars Mary Feinsod Katzenstein and Maureen R. Waller explain. Instead of serving as a source of support and protection for poor families, the state saps resources from indigent families of loved ones in the criminal justice system in order to fund the state's project of poverty governance.
In local jails, the incentives behind this practice are particularly egregious. Many people are detained in jails pre-trial essentially because they are too poor to afford bail. For people who are unable to post a bail bond, the median annual income prior to incarceration in the United States is just shy of $20,000 per year. Considering roughly a quarter of all cases are eventually dismissed, this means a significant number of people who are arrested but never convicted of a crime nonetheless subsidize the punishment infrastructure. Put another way, welfare funds help jails supplement their budgets by levying fines and fees against large numbers of detained people who are only there because they cannot afford to leave. While we focused only on prison policies in our analysis, additional research is urgently needed for the thousands of jail systems nationwide that also have some version of these accounts. We were, however, able to explore some of the ways jails have used welfare funds thanks to the work of investigative journalists from around the country.
How do prisons and jails use these funds if not for the general welfare of incarcerated people? And how do they get away with spending the money in these ways? Our analysis shows that, while some policies permit welfare fund dollars to be spent on things that should clearly be funded through a department's general budget, others are written with language so broad that essentially nothing is off limits. For example, some policies will declare that the funds must be overall or primarily used for the general welfare of the population, or can be spent on goods and services including but not limited to specific uses. These few words provide significant wiggle room that corrections agencies readily exploit in the absence of meaningful oversight. In some cases, money collected in the name of the general welfare of jail populations is actually spent on staff. The Dauphin County, Harrisburg Jail in Pennsylvania, for example, collected $3.4 million between 2019 and 2023. A review of spending records by journalist Joshua Fawn for PENLA found that the vast majority of welfare fund expenditures directly benefited staff, not incarcerated people.
An investigative report in Dauphin County, PA, found that only a small fraction of welfare fund expenditures from 2019 to 2023 directly benefited people incarcerated in the jail. While few jail and prison policies explicitly outline what qualifies as an appropriate use of funds, our breakdown above generally follows the logic of a Montana audit that attempts to parse appropriate, questionable, and inappropriate expenditures.